relation to the Tala incident from someone that was afterwards, and he was referring to hysterical coverage and whatever like that. And he said, why don't the media talk about hospital waiting lists? And why don't the media talk about evictions? And why don't the media talk about the number of people that have self-harmed on the basis of indebtedness? And I've written stories about every one of those. I mean, there's a little interesting one here before I hand over to Eric, who's bursting here beside me to jump in. Jerry Heaney. Who's Jerry Heaney? Hands up anybody who knows what Jerry Heaney is. You're sure you probably do. Beaumont. Jerry Heaney was the Aer Lingus worker who was on a trolley in Beaumont and who was basically covered in vomit for about 14 hours because staff were so overworked. And Jerry Heaney's story was front page in every single newspaper in the country. Jerry Heaney's story was covered by The Independent when they contacted him in protest over the manner he was treated in Beaumont. His case was covered when he died. His case was covered at the inquest, and his case was also covered when there was a formal apology in the Dáil over the manner in which he was treated. So, for someone to say that the media doesn't take issues to do with hospital waiting lists, I mean, did anybody pick up the papers this morning and look at the coverage of the hospital waiting list issue? Strikes that are coming? And the media takes these things very, very seriously. Tyrrellstown? Anybody follow Tyrrellstown? Yes. There's a reporter with the Irish Independent who has been 6 days in a row for 8 hours in Tyrrellstown, feeding the Herald, the Independent Online, and the Sunday Independent. To the point where one of his colleagues actually asked him, was he trying to buy one of the homes at a discounted rate? That's how long he was spending out there. So issues like that are taken very, very seriously, because this whole thing of that some people seem to believe that there's a sinister agenda there, it doesn't sell papers. What sells papers? And I'm speaking purely from the point of view of printing newspapers. That's what I work, that's where my heart is. I've always and only ever wanted to work for a newspaper. Despite the fact that a friend of mine said to me a couple of weeks ago that I'm the blacksmith of my generation because of the way newspapers are going. But newspapers are bought by ordinary people. And if you don't sell newspapers to ordinary people by covering the issues that matter to ordinary people, you're not going to be in business.
Okay, actually, very good. Thanks, Ralph. I think Paul wants to go next. Yeah.
Just because, sorry, I have to step outside at 5:45 to do a debate on drive time with Manny McGrath, of all people, about the prayer and the Dáil, so I'm sure that'll be informative for all. So, do I think the media is biased on the issue of water charges? I do. That's nothing personal about anyone who's involved in the media, and that's not what we're saying. We're not saying people who are involved in the media are all bad people and are all out to do in protesters, etc. I think the bias in the media has been shown in a few ways. I agree. I think the work about the sinister fringe is really good in terms of how the protest movement was portrayed in large sections of the media as a conscious thing, and that contrasted to reasonable people. And I'll make a point about that in a minute, to the extent that how conscious that was by the government, also manipulating the media from its own point of view as part of a pre-existing strategy about reshaping the narrative about water charges. But I think the other way that actually hasn't been spoken about yet is the way that the media treats Irish water. So I think the media has been very happy to do stories about quangos in Irish water and that kind of element of criticism of Irish water. That's been quite a fruitful endeavour for the media, and I don't have a problem with that. But for example, when it comes to the payment figures of Irish water, well then the media is largely unquestioned. I mean, you should, like I spend a lot of time dissecting the press statements from Irish water about payment levels. And they are the most non-transparent press statements that you could possibly imagine. They refuse to answer for legal information requests, from us, from journalists, etc. So they issue statements from time to time that are designed to grab a headline to say 60% are paying water charges, and that's not true. What they're saying is 60% of people who were ever charged water charges have paid at some stage. And that's not that relevant in terms of news, because it's a figure that can only ever go up. But if you look at how media reports payment figures from Irish water again and again and again, and every time they do it, we complain to them, etc., but it doesn't change, they just take it as good coin, what they say. So they accept the basic elements of the headlines of what Irish water puts out, and they don't interrogate them or question them or whatever, in a way that I think would be done to other organisations. And the other aspect is definitely this issue about protests. And I think, because I was reading this, or an earlier version of this paper this morning, and it's really interesting to identify the entry of the term sinister fringe in relation to water charges protesters. And if you look at the timeline, it's really interesting. Because, first of all, go before the protest movement. What was the attitude of the media about protests? A big story was, look, the Irish don't protest. The Greeks, Spanish, Portuguese, Irish people don't protest. And that was kind of a two-sided thing. It was partly a bit mocking of people, like, ha, you've taken all this austerity and you haven't protested. But also it was like, well, we're the good Irish. We just wait in the long grass for an election, we get back in an election, but we don't do anything crazy outside of the framework of elections, parliamentary democracy. That's where democracy basically works. And then if you think about the coverage of the first protest, wasn't like the protest that came afterwards. It was like, oh, there's this big protest that we didn't see coming. The Irish are protesting. And it was treated quite favourably, the first protest. And it even got quite a lot of publicity and stuff in advance of the protest. It was promoted in some ways by sections of the media. And then I think the government and also sections of the media saw what was happening and thought, Jesus, this could turn into a dangerous thing. And then there was a really conscious strategy by the government to create a difference between the sinister fringe and reasonable people. So on the 7th of November, Riegel introduced the term sinister fringe. On the 15th of November, the Jokestown protest happens, which means that that is ramped up as a narrative coming from the government and often repeated by the media. And then the 19th of November 2014, Alan Kelly comes into the Dáil and announces what are portrayed as significant concessions on the issue of water charges. So the ground had been prepared about reasonable people who were involved in these protests. So if you're at the protest, that's okay, we understand it's a reasonable thing to have done, because we understand that some reasonable people are also opposed to water charges. But now we're dealing with those issues for reasonable people. We're giving you this conservation right, we're capping the charges for a number of years, we're delaying them by 3 months, and now we've made concessions. And then the media, in my opinion, like the attitude of the media towards water charges shifted dramatically, and it would be worth comparing kind of October to the end of November, where now what was said was what reasonable people have now accepted this. And that was the narrative, and it was the mantra repeated regardless of the massive protest that then happened in December and another one in the new year. The emphasis was always on, well, it wasn't as big as the protest in October, even though, you know, tens of thousands of people on the streets during the weekday. It's fairly unprecedented in terms of Ireland. So, like, this existed, in my opinion, as a strategy from the government. This idea of creating a difference between, they had to win some people over and create a sinister fringe minority and portray protests as violent, etc. It served a certain purpose in terms of trying to divide the movement. Just two other points. I think one thing is that's interesting to think about is this thing about how does it work. You know, I have a view that the media serves the interests of the 1% in this country unconsciously in terms of the people who are doing it, and generally, you know, echoes their positions, etc. But it is interesting, and it's the same in terms of when you get close to how the government actually works. You know, how is this translated into reality? That the interests of the 1% are translated into the pages of the newspapers or the mouths of presenters or, you know, radio hosts, commentators, etc. And I think it's true that in the majority of cases, you know, Dennis O'Brien does not pick up the phone and say, you've got half the number of people who are at those protests. That's not how it works. But I do think, on the one hand, I think editors are well capable of identifying the interests of Dennis O'Brien and thinking, perhaps even subconsciously, that I think we'll have this particular line and this particular story. Just think they're capable of identifying those interests and almost in a subconscious way. It doesn't have to be a super conscious, cynical thing to do. And the second thing that actually is more significant in my opinion up close than I would have thought from far away is just the extent to which you have a bubble in large sections of the media that people come from, not exclusively, but largely come from a certain class, but also even if people were working class, but then in a certain social circle of people who generally have the same ideas and generally identify their interests with sections of the establishment, well then the idea of a working class revolt in particular, and I think that's what Jokestown represented in particular, is like it's okay for students to slow down cars for a period of time, but a working class community, like, that's dangerous, that's a mob, that's a sinister fringe, etc. And I think, like in my opinion, the late interview that I did with Ryan Tubridy, that just summed that up. Like, Tubridy wasn't acting on instructions from his earpiece. Like, he genuinely was horrified at the notion that working class people are risen up, and there is a thing about me in particular, about being overly personalised, the idea that, Jesus, that guy should know better. He's middle class, he's a privileged revolutionary, and therefore, you know, what's he doing whipping these people up, which is this idea that it's incapable for working class people themselves to get organised, to be active, to be angry, to become politicized, but it has to be an outside agent. Just the final point is to say that I think, like, in my opinion, one of the very best things to come out of the anti-water charges movement is the identification of Denis O'Brien as a hate figure for large sectors of working class. I'm telling you, it's a development in terms of, it's a gain in terms of class consciousness. The identification of somebody who represents the 1%, media, politics, big business, all together, Ireland's Berlusconi. Like, it's really a positive thing that people see, and it's because it's so blatant in certain of O'Brien's newspapers, I'd say, the Sunday Independent in particular. You take the Sunday after Jonestown, you know, they turn their fire on the Anti-Austerity Alliance fire that is often directed at Sinn Féin. They took it, and you just see how that is quite conscious. So the identification of the media, people seeing the role of the media is really good, and the alternative in terms of the widespread use of social media in the context of networks being built in the real world, in terms of information, opinions, etc., and reflected in the online world, I think is a very big positive and a gain for those of us that are fighting for change.
Okay, Paul. Okay, Harry Clarke from UTV Ireland. Harry?
I think after that I better start by establishing where I sit. I don't work for any state-owned company, I don't work for an INM-owned company. I work for UTV Ireland, and recently actually we just got a new owner, we're now owned by ITV, based in the UK.